All right, so first of all, I wanted to make a correction of last week. We talked about the council that was at Nicaea in 325, and we talked about the canon. The canon actually was not discussed at that specific council, but it was the Council of Hippo in 393, as well as another one later. But the point remains the same, and that is, of course, that the scriptures are self-authenticating and the Bible does not rely upon any council or any group of men to decide whether books belong in the Bible or not. Books belong in the Bible because of um, the internal strength of the book, that is by the inspiration, the authenticity, and the only books that were really qualified were the ones that are there. So I wanted to make that mention of regarding last week. So now moving along the timeline of history, we come to one of the most interesting details, and it has a lot of ins and outs about it regarding the first pope. The first pope, of course, was not Peter, but of course was really Boniface number 3, even though men before Boniface number 3, which was in 606 AD, beginning of the 7th century, he was the first one who was actually recognized as universal bishop pope by the Roman emperor. However, there were others before him who claimed that title, and such as Leo the First, who was in Rome in the 5th century, and others as well. But this was the first time that really they gathered around and there was recognition by the Roman emperor. So a couple of things that we need to think about that take place before we look at this, and I just put the major players on the board. It's just it's kind of it's difficult to keep track of them, isn't it? Because not only are their names foreign to us, but the politics of the time are completely completely different than we might imagine. And it's kind of like getting into wading in deep water in political scene today in Washington, D.C. And that's the same thing that was happening here. So look at some of the main players. You have a man who is named John the Fourth. Now, these were the bishops of the particular churches. By the way, the specific churches that were so prominent, what were those prominent churches? They were the churches in the prominent cities, which would be what? Constantinople, Rome, Alexandria, Egypt, Carthage, North Africa, where we've seen several were there already. We've already talked about those that were there. Also, Antioch of Syria. Antioch was the place, of course, where the apostles were sent forth to do the missionary work, and it became one of the major centers of Christianity, and then Jerusalem. So between Jerusalem, Antioch, Carthage, Alexandria, those are on North Africa, and then Rome itself, Constantinople in the east. Between those are the major centers of Christianity because they were the major cities. But there are two cities that really came to the fore more than the others, and people looked to those, and the churches looked to those for guidance and instruction, and that was, of course, Constantinople and Rome. So what happened? How did that all begin? Well, how did Constantinople get to be such a prominent place? How did that happen? They did. They shifted the seat of the empire from Rome to Constantinople in 476. I believe it was 476 AD. So it shifted, but Constantinople was, and I meant to have a map on here, but the map shows you where's Constantinople located? You know offhand, thinking about it? Yeah, it's on the edge of Turkey, between Turkey and which is Asia, and then Europe, and it's on that strait right up there. That's correct. And there's you might have it on your maps, but that's right there. Now today, it's not, what is it called today? Istanbul, that's correct. So that's where it is. So at that time it was Constantinople, named after, of course, Constantine, whom we looked at last week. So there's a bishop there by the name of John the Fourth, and he was known as the Faster because he was known for one who fasted from food and denied himself, the luxuries of eating, and so they called him John the Faster. However, there was also in Rome at the same time Gregory, a man by the name of Gregory, and he was called Gregory number 1, or Gregory the First, and the dates that he ruled as a bishop were up there, 590 to 604. You can see that John the Faster, who died in 595, end of the 6th century, overlapped with Gregory, who was in Rome, the Bishop of Rome. So the interesting thing is they both vied for power, they both vied for position. So here's basically how the story goes. And then we have the emperor named Mauritius. Sometimes, I think in some textbooks I've seen, his name is put out as Maurice. I don't know that, I think that's probably an anglicized version of it, but Maurice might be easier for us to remember. And then he was murdered, and by the man who murdered him was Phocas, P-H-O-C-A-S. Phocas became the emperor, and that was in the same period of time. So Phocas became the emperor also. There was another man who was just actually in between those two, but he only ruled a short period of time. So there's murder and intrigue in the emperor's palace, and so the bishops at Rome and Constantinople are vying for position. This is kind of interesting, sad, but interesting. That is, John the Faster was declared to be, by Mauritius, the universal bishop. So who opposed that title? The Bishop of Rome said, no. He said, no, that is the mark of the Antichrist. That's the mark of the Antichrist. Yeah. So Gregory said, no, can't have universal bishop, because he, of course, wanted to be universal bishop. But he said it was a mark of the Antichrist. Well, as things rolled on, that was Mauritius, the emperor, who had crowned or recognized John the Faster as universal bishop, but now Mauritius is murdered, and so we have another emperor coming to the fore, and his name is Phocas. So Gregory makes overtures to Phocas, and what does he want? He wants to be recognized as the universal bishop. And so finally, that's exactly what happened. Phocas recognizes Gregory as the universal bishop. Now, that was right before he died. In 595, Gregory, I think I have his, no, that was John the Faster. Gregory died in 604, and he was recognized then as universal bishop. It was still an arguable point at that particular time, until finally Gregory was replaced by this man, Boniface number 3, and that was in 606 AD, and he was now recognized by Phocas as the universal bishop. So officially, Boniface number 3 was the first pope. Even though it has been declared by some, such as Leo back in the 5th century, 404 I think was his year, he declared that he was universal bishop, but they were all arguing at that point. And they withdrew fellowship from each other on what day to celebrate Easter, what day whether it should be on the Sunday, whether it should be during the week, and whether it should be aligned with the Jewish calendar or not. And they would actually withdraw fellowship and so-called excommunicate the other bishops for the wrong stance on that particular point. All of which, of course, is outside of the New Testament anyway, isn't it? So isn't that remarkable that this is how this power struggle got going? I think this is interesting also, that our founding fathers recognized that this is the way that human nature is, And struggling for power and domination is just a part of human nature. And so they avoided all of that assiduously. They avoided that kind of thing, and they made it a government of and for and by the people. And the government, or the people I should say, bequeathed to the government only so many pieces of authority, so much power that we ourselves actually have. And the reason they did that is because of all this kind of thing that was going on. And they had escaped, many of the forerunners of the founding fathers had escaped from England, where they had had this kind of domination by the Roman popes. So it was an evolution of time that actually occurred that brought about Boniface III as the first pope. So what passage in the New Testament is utilized by the Roman Catholic Church to support the universal bishop or the universal pope idea? Matthew 16, 16 through 18. So let's look at it for just a moment. Matthew 16, 16 through 18. So if you're going to discuss with the Roman Catholic anything about the bishop of Rome or the pope, they're going to be running as quickly as they can to Matthew 16, verses 16 and following, the passage that is well known to all of us. So let's look at it for just a moment. This, of course, takes place in Caesarea Philippi, according to verse 13. Peter announces that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, or he actually confesses that, made that confession. And then you have this statement made by our Lord. Verse 17, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, flesh and blood has not revealed it unto thee, but my Father who is in heaven. And I will say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. So let's notice the passage, verse 18 specifically. So first of all, let's pick up the gates of Hades. What does that mean? The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. What are the gates of Hades? That's right. Death and entering into the afterlife. I appreciate the way that you put that, because that tells us that it's not, we normally in the King James translates it how? Hell, gates of hell. The word hell is an English translation of Hades, and frequently it is used that way, such as in Acts 2. But that is a misunderstanding on our part, because at that time when the King James was translated, hell refers not simply to the place of torment, but also to the land of the dead. And the real idea is the land of the dead, Hadean realm. We use hell today to refer to punishment, but this is the land of the dead. So what does that say? Yes, sir. And that's why the word Hades appears here, because there's still no English word for it. It's Hades. Hades is a Greek word. That's a transliteration. It's not even an English word, Hades. That's a Greek word, Hades, Hadean realm. We're looking at Matthew chapter 16, verses 16 through 18. Talking about the first pope, we kind of went through that, Boniface III. So we referred back to Matthew 16 just to show how Roman Catholic debaters want to support that Peter was the first pope, etc. So the first thing we're looking at then is the gates of Hades. So it's the gates, the land of the dead will not prevail against it. So what is that to say? That's correct. So even though Jesus died, it would not prevent him from building his church. Now, I say that because an important point is made here. Frequently, people take this text to say that it will always be in existence and it will never be dominated or never go completely dark. That is, there will always be Christians on the earth. I believe that probably is true regarding the fact that there will always be Christians, but I do not believe that's what this passage is teaching. He's actually saying the gates of Hades, gates of hell, gates of Hades, the land of the dead will not prevent him from establishing his church. So what is that to say? He's talking about his death, burial, and resurrection, and it will be established. And it does show us it will be established after his death, burial, and resurrection, doesn't it? That's interesting also. Right. So it was not established yet. It was established after his death, burial, and resurrection. So that's number one. Number two, let's look at Peter now. Peter's name, of course, is rock, which is Petros, and that's masculine, of course. Petros is rock. But Jesus says, upon this rock, and he doesn't use the word Petros, he uses the word Petra, which is a feminine word which refers to a ledge or a rock mountain. Petros is a small rock. That's what Peter's name was, Petros. But he says now, upon this rock, that is Petra, feminine noun, upon this ledge, I'm going to build my church. So what is he saying? So let us just suppose that Jesus is saying that upon Peter, I will build the church. Let's just say that's the case. Does that show us, number one, that Peter was a pope? No. No, it does not. As a matter of fact, the same wording is used in Matthew 18, verse 18, of all the apostles. Whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. All the apostles had that authority. So number one, even if he says, upon Peter I will build this church, if that's what he's saying, and that's what the Roman church tells us it means, it doesn't say anything about being a pope. Number two, it has nothing about his infallibility, speaking out of the chair, that is out of the chair. He was inspired, of course, and his words were infallible, but it has nothing about that going forward to pass on to other people. As a matter of fact, it doesn't have anything to say about any successor of Peter at all, does it? We don't have one word of the Bible that gives us any idea that Peter had any successor to the office of pope if he is the pope. We have no word on that at all. Well, how would that come about? Only by the assertions of the Roman church. So it has nothing to do with succession of office, has nothing to do with how he's going to manage the office, anything like that, even if it was to say that Peter is the rock upon which I build the church. But the truth of the matter is, he's not building the church upon Peter. He's building it upon the truth that Peter confessed. That's why he changes to a feminine noun and says, upon this Petra rock I will build this church, my church. That is to say, Jesus is using a word play, Petros, Petra, using a word play simply to show the truth, and that is, the truth was, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. That is the truth upon which the church is built. That's the Petra. That is the ledge of rock upon which the church is built. Not Peter himself, Petros. All right, any questions, any thoughts on that? That's right. It's like a mountain. It's like a ledge. Bedrock is a good word for it. Petros is simply a stone that you cast. It's a stone that you put in a sling. Petros, that's a stone. But Petra is a ledge. Petra is a feminine word, and it does not refer to Peter. And that's what Jesus uses here. Upon this rock, I will build my church. All right, so so from that particular point, it also is the case that history, as we've already seen, shows us that there was no recognition of any universal bishop until we come to the 6th and 7th centuries. They argued and they withdrew fellowship from one another. They had no love lost between them, and they had no recognition. Matter of fact, the early church fathers argued against anybody taking such a position as, I'm going to be the head bishop of all the church. They would argue about that. And that's clear from history. So even though it is the case that some of the bishops of Rome and then later bishops of Constantinople claimed to be universal bishop, it was really not the case. That was not recognized that way in history. So what does that mean? It means that the history that is come up with by the Roman Church that takes us all the way back to Peter, you've seen charts, that he's the first pope and he was followed by so-and-so and so. That is all conjured up. It has nothing to do with reality. It's nothing at all to do with reality. Now, the history that I gleaned these from are multiple. Number one, Augustus Neander, who was a German historian, also Mosheim, who was a Jewish historian, they're both classical historians, wrote voluminously on these particular topics, as well as others. And then that's been honed down. If you want to read some more of it, it's by F.W. Maddox in his book, The Eternal Kingdom, who was teaching at Sunset School of Preaching for a long time. So I think it was Sunset. Wasn't it Sunset or was it Lubbock Christian? One of the two. Lubbock Christian. May have been Lubbock Christian. He was in Lubbock, though. So, and there are many other sources that you can find on that particular. So even though the history is confusing and sordid, but that's basically how the history works out. All right, any thoughts on that? All right, so from that particular point, I want to bring out something else that's kind of interesting. Through the centuries, the Roman Catholic Church has come up with so many documents that supposedly were historical to support that Peter was the first pope, and here's the line of popes. So let me just refer to that. And one of them was called Isidorian Decretals. Here it is. Yeah, so there was a Spanish bishop in his year, he is in the 7th century. He's an archbishop in Spain. His name is Isidore. Isidore had a reputation, later it was found out he had a reputation for forgeries, and he did. He made forgeries. So they had a number of decretals that were come out, and I think there were a number of 59. There were 59 spurious writings that were called now the Isidorian Decretals. 59, right? They were discovered later to be spurious. That is not authentic. And he had 59 of them in which he was purporting that one bishop is writing to another bishop and recognizing the pope. And all of it was conjured up, fake documents to support the idea that Peter was the first pope, and then the popes followed them all in Rome. What happened? Well, that was discovered later on. Let's see if I have his name here. It was discovered later on that these were forged documents. And so it's very famous in Roman history, or in the history of the world. The Isidorian Decretals were all forged documents, 59 of them. So what does that say? What does that tell you? Number one, no real historical documentation. Number two, the Roman Church was in the business of forging documents. Now that is absolutely the case. That's exactly what happened. They forged scores of documents, forged them. And it was discovered later that this was the case. Now that to me is alarming, to think that so many people kind of go along with it, even though these documents were completely false, forged documents. And it shows you that their desire was to make up a history to take you back to Peter, that Peter was the first pope. It also shows us that there was no real history at all that shows that. Otherwise, why make up history? Why make up documents if there's real history that you can rely upon? Say, here's what it says, here's what was written. Why make up documents? You don't have to. There would be no reason to make up documents if indeed real history reads that way. So all of that should put a big cloud of skepticism on people regarding what the Roman Church puts out as far as their documents as proof. Now here's another interesting thing. When was the Pope decreed to be infallible? When was that? 1870 something. It was 1873, 1874. It was not until then that the Pope was declared to be infallible. All through the years, he was not said to be infallible, but only when it come to 1873, they put out a document, and it was in 1870, I say 73, But it was 1870s that the Pope was infallible. What does that say? All right, that tells us it was all an evolution. It's an evolutionary movement. That's what it is. There's no infallibility of the Pope until 1870s. So if you want to read about that, Brother Hoyt Wallace Jr. has a great book on it called Bulwarks of the Faith. He has one which he talks about Protestant denominationalism and Baptist theology and so forth. And the second half of it is Roman Catholicism, and he talks about the Vatican documents, and it's very, very interesting. Very interesting to read. So that's how the history works out. So it's all a evolution of movement. All right, any thoughts, any questions on it? They admitted it. Yeah, they came out and admitted it. They were forged documents. That was, and I had, I think I have the notes of that particular. Let's see. I think I do. Oh yeah. So here it is. This is interesting. I thought about this before I came in here, and I thought we're going to have some members of the church here who love this, isn't it? The man's name was Blundell. That's right, Blundell. Yeah, Blundell. He spells it a little differently, but B-L-O-N-D-E-L. So it was not until the 17th century, that would be in the 1600s, that the Reformed theologian Blundell proved them to be false. Yes, the Blundells did it, and the Blundells did it. There we go. And so then when that happened, then the Roman Church did finally confess, because he did. I don't know how he got how he proved it and showed it. I haven't got that deep into it, but he did show them to be false, and the Roman Church confessed. Yeah, they're false documents. But here's the interesting thing. Nicholas I was a pope in the 9th century, 858 and following, and he made use of these decretals to increase the spiritual authority of the papacy in the world. He made use of these decretals. He exalted the papacy in every conceivable manner. He not only claimed supremacy, but also carried out the claim by deposing and excommunication a man by the name of Photius, Constantinople bishop, Archbishop of Constantinople, and humbling John, the Archbishop of Ravenna, to complete submission. So see, what they were doing was still arguing about who is the head of the church. Who's the real president of the United States? We don't have fair elections. See, we're still arguing about it. And that's what they're going on to say. So he pulled these out to prove that, all right, Rome is the place where it has the universal bishop. And so that's how they used them. But it was not until, of course, Blundell in the 17th century, 1600s. That was after. So they've been using these for a long time to bring power to Rome. Interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it is. Yeah. So it's all a power struggle. So that's really what we need to see. So not only that, let's talk about a little bit about, for a moment, the wedding of church and state, and what our founders were avoiding was the wedding of church and state. Now, what does that mean, wedding of church and state? Now, that's not a constitutional phrase. That's how Thomas Jefferson worded it. But what were they concerned about? Now, let's just bring it down to America right here, and we'll see where we're way off beam here today. A government-established religion. That's exactly right, a government-established religion. So, what happened was, when the seat of the empire moved from Rome, 476, to Constantinople. Now, there's the emperor over here in Constantinople. All of the structure and all of the government offices and that kind of and the official titles were left to the Roman Church. And so the Roman Church, and today the Roman Church is the smallest country in the world. It's a secular government. It has wedded secular government together with a religious organization. So we have secularism and religion tied together. So when our founders came to America, they wanted, as Jefferson put it, but separation of church and state. But the idea was that he wrote to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist when he was president, and he said, we don't want a wedding of the two. What were they afraid of? The same thing we've been looking at the entire time. And that is when the Roman Church became wedded to the state, and now they are crowning the kings, they are crowning the emperors, and the emperors in turn are giving them the title universal bishop. And that's exactly what happened here. So when, for example, Boniface III was recognized as the universal bishop, the Pope, well, that had already been taking place because he had been currying favor with Phocas, the emperor. And the emperor now turns around and recognizes him, not Constantinople bishop, but you in Rome. And that's how they did it. And so they was kind of one scratched another's back, just like horses, chewing on each other's withers a little bit, and that's how they did it. So we have wedding of church and state. So what was it that we wanted to avoid in America? A government-sponsored religion. Nothing to do with, don't mention God, don't have God on your coins, don't say a pledge of allegiance to God, don't mention God in government, don't mention God here, don't mention God there, don't say anything about God in schools. Nothing to do with that. It has only to do with we did not want a church that was sponsored, supported by the state. We didn't want the wedding of church and state. And so freedom, the First Amendment, freedom of religion refers to keeping the state out of the church. Yes, sir. Right. That's correct. And the Church of England. So, and that gets to the time of, for example, Henry VIII. Henry VIII wanted to marry a woman that was not his wife. So what did he do? He appealed to the Pope at Rome. Pope said, no, can't do that. He said, well, I'll start my own church. And he did. And he became the head of it, and it's the Church of England. That's what the Episcopal Church is. And so he started his own church, but it was all wedding of church and state. So when we came to America, our forefathers, this is what we wanted to avoid. And the reason was not only because we didn't want the wedding of church and state, but once that happens, then what occurs? What begins to occur? What do you think happens when there is a state-sponsored religion? Dictates to you what you're going to believe. So, for example, when you come to America in the colony period, there were state-sponsored churches. All of the colonies had a sponsored church, and most of them were things like the Church of England or a congregational church, and they would pay taxes to that church. And then Maryland was the only one that was the Roman Church. They paid taxes to the Roman Church coffers. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, if you don't... That's right. So you say, I think that the Church of England is wrong. Well, too bad. You're paying the preacher in the English church to preach, even though you say he is wrong doctrinally. And this is what our founders said we've got to avoid. But not only did they dominate doctrinally, what else began to happen with the Roman Church? The most bloody and horrific persecutions that you can ever imagine at the hands of the Roman Church. Popes went to battle. They sat on horses and went to battle with other, and it was a war-making machine. And the persecutions that occurred were so horrific that finally, in the Reformation period, then the men such as the William Tyndales of the world, who, by the way, was burned at the stake for translating the Bible into the common vernacular by the Roman Catholic Church. And many of them like that. John Huss burned him at the stake. You know, it's a sad story, and you can read that so frequently, but that was the way that they dominated it. And until, of course, the arrival of the printing press in the 1500s, Gutenberg's printing press, and then the Bibles were put out multiple copies, and so it's a little bit different. But that's the desire of men, to wed their own religious beliefs with the state power of government. And that's what's going on in America right now. You have, for example, a secular government wedded with environmental concepts, which is basically New Age religious beliefs, and they're going to mandate it, and this is how it's going to go, whether you believe it or not. And that's how you're going to do it. And it's all religious. And that's why our founding fathers came to America, to avoid all of that And that's how it began right there. All right, any questions on that? Yes. Well, in my view, first of all, she asked about the transitioning of children, sex change operations. Now we're having this big war in this country. So, in my view, this is what happens when you empty Christianity out of a culture, and we're left with paganism. And every man does that which is right in his own eyes. So now we have trouble because who's going to stop that kind of thing from happening? So we try to empower the state to do it, the federal government, and so we get to a big mess, but constitutionally, but I think that'll be able to stop that, but nevertheless. And also parental rights. We've lost parental rights in this. I mean, it's just parental rights have really gone the way of all the earth in a lot of respects. So there's a lot of different things taking place that might reflect some of that what was going on in the early ages. I do think it's paganism. I think it's paganism. Yeah, I do think it's paganism. And when they put it in law that they can do that, I think it's paganism. Yeah, I do. Well, well, however you want to slice it, I think it's paganism. Paganism is a worldview, and that's the paganistic worldview. Yeah. So that's how things began to shape up. So what we're going to do in the next class period or two is we'll look at how some of the things began to be dominant in the Roman church and what the Roman church now mandated as far as the worship is concerned, and how these things also began to transition, to use that word, transition, but there's an evolution in how the worship of the Roman church was going to be carried on. And once you have a universal bishop and you have bishops deciding here's what's going to happen and here's how it's going to go, and then you have to go through the local priests and the local bishops, then you have a completely different religious picture than you do of the New Testament. Just absolutely the opposite. So that's where we're going to go next with it. So any other thing? I'll give you the last 2 or 3 minutes here. Yeah, 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 it is. And see, that's my understanding. That's not what a judge is to be. He's to be simply to be deciding on what the law is, and the people are deciding what the laws are by which they live. But yeah, that doesn't matter. I think you're right about that. That's yeah, yeah. All right, any other thoughts? Okay, so that was we jumped down to the 7th century, the beginning of it. Boniface number 3. If you wanted to do more reading, I'll tell you there's Alexander Campbell had a debate with Catholic Bishop Purcell, which was in 1837, and that's available. And he goes through that history with a fine-tooth comb, Alexander Campbell does, and brings it out, unlike any other person before him. I think it just brings it out clearly. He utilized Mosheim and other historians to point out the first pope. And but anyway, and I think we may have that book in our library. So, but there are other ones also that you can look at as well. So, all right. Thank you for your participation.